chairing. Just a reminder to all colleagues and members of the public that our meetings are webcast. So I will just go quickly through the housekeeping issues because this is the bit I always forget. If anybody needs the toilets, they're there with the big sign that says toilets on them. We're not expecting a fire alarm, so if it goes off, the escape route is via the main reception. And could everyone please switch mobile phones to silent? We have one substitute for the committee today. Councillor Hook is standing in for Councillor Mason, thank you very much. And we also have one apology, Councillor Dave Taylor, and we do not have a substitute for him. So, agenda item 1, declarations of interest. Do members have any interests they would like to declare? No, marvellous, thank you. Agenda item 2, minutes. Are members happy for me to note the minutes from the meeting held on the 29th of July 2019? Yes, and I would just like to thank, from the matters arising, Debbie for very kindly supplying members with the information that we required incredibly promptly. It was all with us by the following day. So I'm happy to sign that off. Agenda item 3, public participation. We have one registration to speak this evening. Ms Swinburne, who wishes to speak on agenda items relating to internal audit and information governance. Welcome, Ms Swinburne. I think you've been here before. Yes, we are.
Seem a long way away today. Okay.
Yes, perhaps this is a bigger room than we actually needed, but you have 3 minutes to address the committee. I will give you a heads up after 2.5 minutes.
Thank you. I will send you my comment.
Will be covered in the later agenda items.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Now, moving on to the agenda items, I've had a request that we move agenda item 6, the key corporate risks, forward, and I'm happy with colleagues' agreement to do that. Lovely. So we will move to agenda item 6, which is, when I find the right page,
41.
page 41, the key corporate risks. You don't have name tags. Just wondered if,
Sorry.
yes.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Sarah and Neil, when you, if you could just introduce yourselves and your role, that would be incredibly helpful.
You
know, and as members of the public may be aware, and as Sarah's pointed out, each Audit and Governance Committee meeting, we do look at one of the key corporate risks in more detail. At the last meeting, we asked for a specific report covering York Central, which is just one of the risks within the...
I don't usually get a name check, so I thought I should just come in. And I was going to make a point generally. As you say, the 2 new actions on page 58, I take the first one about A&G to basically say that we agreed to take project management off life support by stopping asking for 6 monthly progress reports. And that was 2017, I think,
yes,
when Verto was being established.
Yes.
But there is a bit of a conflict in my head, and I'd be interested in your view, not about York Central, but generally about project management.
Certainly.
Just a quick comeback. I mean, that's sort of reassuring and in the context of York Central. I wonder whether the committee might consider at some point asking Dave Atkinson as the Verto sponsor within the council, to come back to us at some point in the future, in the forward plan, just to give us a broader view from a project management, project control perspective of whether, I'm not suggesting whether he disagrees with Neil, but whether he has that same perspective.
Absolutely.
That things have, I don't think there's any question that things have improved. The question for me is, have they got good enough? And is there still a momentum to make them a really tight project management system? But that's perhaps a question for later. But thank you for the answer.
No worries.
The points that you were making, I think, were highlighted in Annex D5, page 109, that's dated April. So, just in respect of that, we are further along from PC1, the project framework context, and PC2.
I mean, in terms of PC1, PC2, there are still
complex diagram. I think as a follow-up, if there is an issue with one of those strands or one of those partners, how is that fed through to the whole, and how quick is that process? And I know it will, how long's a piece of string? It might vary depending on the issue. But it's just, how is that decision made? This is a real risk and we need to inform all the projects, or actually one of the projects is really struggling. How is that fed back through to everybody else?
That's the core focus of the Delivery Coordination Board. That's the owner.
Obviously, we are hostages to fortune on some aspects of this. Things like, for example, it's unlikely because the site has largely been developed, but suppose we found a major archaeological find there which had to be excavated, which would delay the project, or suppose some major other funding strands did not come through. That could lead to delay. We've seen that in numerous places. Bradford been a classic example where a scheme that was supposed to go through didn't. At the end of the day, who picks up the tab if the scheme is delayed? Because that will inevitably increase costs. Are the costs shared between all the various agencies? Does the City of York Council pick it up, or what?
You work out from that, and then that will go to members, to executive, for their consideration and decision. Is that right?
It's not,
you won't make like the strategic delivery board won't make a decision. Right, we stop.
No. All I would comment and add to that is it would be a.
You're the czar, are you?
If you want to call it that, yep.
Well, apparently that's the title. Week we got the publication of the Yellowhammer report, and that did include some really quite specific risks to local authorities and to individuals, but that would have an impact on local authority risk. And I'm just wondering to what extent we've really analysed those and put mitigations in place for them.
Yeah, I think it's pretty fair to say there's nothing within the...
Thank you. I just want to first reflect that what we're looking at here is not what might or might not happen in terms of Brexit, because our job isn't to think about that, thankfully, or solve that issue, but to look at our risk assessment and whether we have an appropriate risk assessment with appropriate controls that can be put into place should the worst happen. So I suppose when I read this, I thought it was a really good assessment of some of the impact mainly on those individuals whose status might...
Is the point I'm making. That is another statutory committee.
And be clear, if you were interested in doing that, what you would be inviting them to look at, because there seem to me to be two things on the face of it. There's the original piece of work, and then there's the aspect, which is something also scrutiny could technically look at, but you've been given the answers as to why there's been a delay, so...
Just to finish off on that, if I may, and then I'll shut up. I have a bit of a track record on this, as you'll know, as Dawn will probably know and Debbie will know. I've had meetings with the new health and safety manager, picking up on some other issues, and it continues to concern me, and it's not something when I was in my working career that I was particularly big on health and safety, but I'm shocked
I wouldn't say that.
at the way in which the council treats what in my working life would have been significant issues. But there is, as I understand it, an audit currently underway on health and safety across the council, which will report, I can't remember when, but sometime this year. And I would, from my perspective, it seems to me it would be sensible to wait and hear what that has to say. And then if there still is an issue, then I guess we have the option of asking the health and safety manager to come here, or conversely we could refer it through. But at this point, I think I'm in a big enough hole with health and safety without digging further.
Thank you. Suzanne, you had a view.
Yeah, yes.
You're not on.
I'm not on. My husband would probably tell you I have no need for a microphone. Another alternative, and it's just a thought, is that this is a specific action arising out of an audit that hasn't been implemented. We have a health and safety manager. An agreed revised date has been presumably agreed with that individual. The committee could simply as quickly as possible. It will be pretty much a desktop exercise, taking on board various comments and sort of liaising with Debbie, for example, around the financial contract regulations and procurement areas, and talking to Dawn's team around decision making and things like that. The second sort of stage, which is a different process, is to look at the decision-making structure within the council itself and how you want to undertake that process. And following the Localism Act, the government reinstituted the option of having a committee system, and there is a specific process you have to follow if one is considering doing that. And some councils have. Some councils have said, not for us. Some councils said, yes, we want to do it. Interestingly, at least one council went back to the committee system and has now gone back to the executive. So it's purely a decision of the members of council as to how you want to structure yourselves. So the second stage would be to look at how you would, what the options are and what the pros and cons of that are. I think one thing the administration are very clear on is they would want cross-party political buy-in if there was a proposal to move back to a committee system, simply because of the burdens it places on elected representatives. And those of us who are old enough, and I'm not making eye contact with anybody at this point in time, to remember working under committee system, yes, Dawn, you're one of them, I am as well, know that the whips have got quite a challenging job in getting people into committees and making sure of attendance, and that's politically challenging. It's also quite difficult in a fairly balanced council politically, because having enough posteriors on perches is really important. So there's all those considerations, but that would run alongside it. Obviously, depending on the outcome of that, you would then have to go back to your constitution. As I said, ideally, I'd really like to leave that to the end, but I'm mindful that there's some concerns expressed about the accuracy of the document as it exists at the moment, and clearly going through a process of considering a change to the decision-making structure is much longer. It has to be implemented under the legislation at an annual council, but a decision has to be made prior to the annual council to implement a new process. That doesn't mean to say you can't make a decision in year to implement at the end of the year, but the last date you would be able to make that decision would be in March council meeting. And one of the risks I've seen, and I've mentioned it here and I've mentioned it in the executive report, is to do a proper consultation and a proper process I think is very challenging to achieve a position of being able to make a decision in March. And the reason for that is if you were minded to make that decision, I think you would need some quite significant time as individual political groups and collectively to look at how that would work for you. And that isn't an easy decision to make. And I only say that to be very open and transparent. I think if you were going to go for that, you would probably struggle to have that everything in place for you to make a decision in principle in March to implement in May. So I've made that point to the executive. I'll make it again next week and I make it to yourselves. So that's what's proposed. The reason for the report was to make sure, as Audit and Governance Committee, with your, as I've set out in the report, your particular constitutional remit, that you were aware of what was proposed and to sort of give you some time to think about how you would want to engage in those stages. As I say, ideally, and I'm being, very glass half full, I would like to bring back the proposed update to the Constitution to your December meeting, but that might be optimistic, but we can only try. It very much depends on when you get into it, and I can only be honest with you, how much work is involved. But ideally, if we're just bringing it up to date, removing some of the inconsistencies, etc., it might be possible to do that. It's whether you want to just receive that report then, or whether you would like a working group of a smaller number of you to look at it in advance, so when it comes, a number of you are already cited on what's proposed and are comfortable with what's proposed. It's a matter for yourselves. It comes forward as a joint report from myself and the working party. I should make it clear, legally the committee would still have discretion to say we're not happy with that. But it's an alternative. Alternatively, you may say, well, I'm happy with you to go away and do that detailed technical work and just bring it to us. With regard to the rather larger piece of work, I think it would be helpful you to think about how you might want to engage in some of the detail around that.
Thanks, Suzanne. That's incredibly helpful as a summary of where we are. Before we go into sort of debate, the things that we need to take into account are this process is proposed to go under 2 chunks, essentially. There's the tidying up, housekeeping, which I think you felt that could be done by December.
Ideally, yes.
Though potentially just a tad longer. And secondly, the larger decision-making.
Groups, the political parties as political groups, the different committees. But again, the governance structure of the organisation and the oversight of that falls to this committee. So again, this committee has to have oversight of how we move forward. Ultimately, because let's be realistic, if it goes to full council, so again, executive will need some oversight because they will, obviously as the administration, want to take a view on whether that's something they would support at full council, being brutally honest about that. And there's lots of pluses and minuses with changing to a different system of decision making. And it's not necessarily nailed on that when you've done all the consultation and looked at that and unpicked it, you necessarily decide that an alternative way is the right way. What you might decide is to look at improvements to what you've already got and to look at how that might work more efficiently and what's lacking. So the whole process is not just about it's this or this, it's about this could work well and this can work well, what's happening in York now and what might we want to see. It needs very much to be member-led, but it also needs consultation from other interested parties, because obviously it's not just about the decisions you make, it's the impact they have in other places. So it's quite challenging to do that, but ultimately it rests with this organisation, and by that I mean the 47 members of this organisation, to decide on how you, as elected representatives of your communities, want to take the decisions that affect your communities. So I'm very clear that whatever I might think it works well, and I've worked under both systems, so I know historic advantages and disadvantages. it is a matter for yourselves. And as I say, because of the particular remit of this committee in the Constitution, it is something you have, well, you should have, and in my view, have to have oversight of.
Can I just ask you, is there an implication, given that we haven't currently got a Director of Governance? We have you, obviously, but...
Yes, you have me for the meantime. For the meantime.
Temporarily.
Yes, they are out to advert for the Director of, I'm trying to think what they've called it now, Governance. I think it is just Governance.
Yeah, it is, yeah.
It is, yeah, just Governance, which would effectively incorporate the monitoring officer role, as I understand it, and a wider governance role. And I would hope they would be in a position to appoint sometime before, certainly the end of the year, with them starting, as I understand it, next year. So they would presumably pick this up when they start.
Councillor Webb.
Right, so I think on the first issue of tidying up, my proposal would be that the tidying up occurs as you see fit, and then essentially we as a committee have essentially just a briefing on that prior to then debating here. Obviously, for something that needs to be done right, more than a week to traipse through papers and things like that, I think is essential, and actually a face-to-face meeting I think would work for that, and then we could have that if it's doable by December. On the second issue, I think we as a committee, if you're going to do this with the Constitution, I think I totally accept what you say about behaviours need to change. Constitutions can't do that, but behaviours need to change. But if you're going to do it right, firstly, I think we need to know where this has come from, what the fire is, why does it need to be done straight away, and then I think we do need to, as a group, whether we have, I would suggest a subcommittee where we specifically are tasked with looking at the positives and the negatives, because it is within our remit as the Audit and Governance Committee to lead on this, really. It might be an idea for the executive and it might be something they want to do, but actually
of whatever I just said.
5, 6, everybody.
Excellent. Are you happy?
Well,
yes. Happy as you're going to be.
Happy as I'm going to be.
Yeah.
Could I just make a point that I think we need to feed our comments that have been made tonight into the executive meeting next week?
Yeah. I know the papers have come out today, but I'm wondering if an appendix or something could be added to the report as we did look at it.
Pardon? I might, sorry Chair, I might just, because I'm on leave until next Tuesday, that might be a bit of a challenge.
Oh.
But I can certainly, I've got detailed notes.
On page 199, it says that the FOI social receivers going down from 554 to 455, which is a massive reduction, and yet everything else seems to have got worse. So how come we can't cope with the lower volume, or are they really more complicated?
I've started the drill down.
For the last couple of years, we've hit a 90% target. It's unlikely that the nature of the FOI requests have markedly changed. So the issues that you've raised will have been there 2 years ago and last year. It is disappointing that the performance has deteriorated to quite such a significant extent, and in all of those different areas. And I'm just wondering, is there some sort of common thread that's running? Why different directorates are still delaying producing FOIs in time?